Racist cops arrest a black man. You won't believe the shocking twist that changes everything. It was a quiet evening on a dimly lit street in an upscale neighborhood. The air hung still, broken only by the faint hum of cicadas. Two police officers stood by their squad car, their eyes fixed on a sharply dressed black man stepping out of a sleek luxury vehicle parked in a driveway. "He doesn't look like he belongs here," one muttered, suspicion dripping from his tone. The man adjusted his suit jacket with deliberate precision. Calm and composed, he carried himself with quiet authority. But the officers didn't see that. They saw what they wanted to see, a suspect. Their hands hovered near their holsters, the tension between them thick and palpable. They had no idea the man they were about to confront wasn't just another target. He wasn't another statistic. Tonight wasn't about the law or justice. It was about their prejudice. What happens next? It will leave you speechless. The evening air hung heavy with a mix of stillness and tension. In a secluded corner of a wealthy suburban neighborhood, the hum of cicadas provided the only sound, until the faint whine of a sleek black car echoed through the streets. It was a quiet, unassuming scene, until Marcus Williams pulled into his driveway. Marcus wasn't just any man. He was one of the youngest justices to ever serve on the Supreme Court, a man whose words and rulings reverberated across the nation. Yet, in this moment, he wasn't the towering figure of justice the world knew him to be. No, tonight, he was just another black man driving a luxury car through a quiet, upscale neighborhood. A neighborhood that held its own unspoken rules. He parked his car with practiced precision, stepping out of the vehicle with the briefcase still firmly in hand. His suit jacket fit him perfectly, his stride measured and confident, though a trace of fatigue lingered in his eyes from a long day in court. For a brief moment, he took a deep breath, savoring the peace of his own home, unaware that tonight the peace would be shattered. Just as Marcus made his way toward the front door, the piercing red and blue lights of a police car flooded his driveway. The sirens wailed through the stillness of the night as two officers emerged from their car, already sizing him up from a distance. To them, he wasn't a Supreme Court justice, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law. He was just a black man, alone in a luxury car, in a neighborhood that didn't seem to belong to him. Their hands hovered near their holsters, an almost imperceptible shift in their posture, signaling the readiness to act. Marcus stopped in his tracks, the silence between him and the officers thick with tension. Their eyes were cold, judgmental, as they looked him up and down. "Doesn't look like he belongs here," one officer muttered, his voice low, almost threatening. Marcus didn't flinch. He knew what they saw. He'd seen it before. The assumption that a man like him didn't belong in a place like this. But this was no ordinary encounter. He wasn't just a target to be controlled. He wasn't just another statistic. He was a man who had fought tooth and nail to build a life defined by respect and dignity. But tonight, none of that mattered. Not to the officers. Not to the world they inhabited. For them, it wasn't about justice. It was about perception. And perception, as Marcus well knew, could be a dangerous thing. As the officers moved toward him, their intentions already clear, he held his ground. This was the moment. This was where the story began. A story that would reveal not just the power dynamics of law enforcement, but the very core of the biases that shaped them. A story that would leave them, and everyone who witnessed it, speechless. Marcus stood under the harsh glow of the police lights, his gaze steady as the two officers approached. The upscale neighborhood, once peaceful, now felt charged with hostility. His briefcase weighed heavy in his hand. The officer's boots echoed on the pavement, each step deliberate. The tall one sized him up with suspicion, his jaw tight. The shorter officer glanced around, his eyes scanning, searching for something to justify the stop. "You know why we stopped you?" The tall officer's voice cut through the air, sharp and accusatory. Marcus held his ground, his expression unreadable. His life had been spent standing in front of bigger battles, higher stakes. But this felt different. This wasn't a courtroom where facts and reason determine the outcome. This wasn't an argument for justice. It was a test of something far more primal: perception. "No, officer," Marcus replied, his voice calm, controlled. "I'm just coming home from a long day at work." The officer didn't like the answer. His eyes flicked to Marcus's luxury car, then back to his face. There was a glint of suspicion in the officer's eyes, as if Marcus's presence here was an affront to everything he believed in. "Long day at work, huh?" The officer's voice dripped with sarcasm. "A man like you driving that car? I'm sure you've been working hard for it." Marcus could feel the air thickening around them, the tension rising with each word. He understood what this was: a racial profiling encounter. It wasn't about the car or the suit. It wasn't about his work or his worth. It was about the narrative they had already written in their minds. He wasn't a Supreme Court justice. He was a suspect. The stocky officer took a few more steps closer, his posture stiff, as if Marcus was a piece of debris they needed to clear off their path. "You mind if we take a look inside your car?" the second officer asked, his tone aggressive. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't move. His gaze never wavered from the two officers, though the weight of their judgment was pressing in on him like a physical force. This wasn't just a stop and question. This was the moment where things could go sideways, or where they could change forever. "I do mind," Marcus said firmly. "You don't have a reason to search my car." The first officer's expression twisted into a smirk, a look that said this wasn't going to go the way Marcus thought. "We'll see about that." His hand hovered over his holster, fingers twitching. There was no real reason for it, but the gesture was enough to send a warning signal through the air. This was escalating. Marcus's heart rate slowed. He didn't let fear creep in. He had faced moments far more dangerous than this, yet none had felt quite as raw, as personal as this one. He understood the stakes. The choice was now his. He could comply, back down, let them do what they wanted. Or he could stand his ground and force them to see him for who he truly was. The tension snapped, but it wasn't the officers who had the upper hand. It was Marcus. "What's your badge number, officer?" he asked, his tone cool but authoritative. It was a simple question, one that cut through the air, freezing everything for a brief, critical moment. The officer paused. A flicker of doubt passed over his face. He didn't expect the question. They never did. They assumed compliance, assumed obedience. But Marcus wasn't just going to give in to the narrative they had created about him. The question hung there, heavier than it should have been. The second officer looked at his partner, then back at Marcus. The silence between them now felt like a standoff, a reckoning. The taller officer's eyes narrowed. "Step away from the car," he barked, his hand brushing near his holster. Marcus's pulse quickened, but he stood firm, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere, officer. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's stance grew more aggressive. "You think you can just roll up here in that car, in this neighborhood, and nothing's wrong?" The shorter officer stepped forward, his eyes flashing with suspicion. "We need to check your ID now." Marcus clenched his jaw, but didn't move. This wasn't just an encounter. It was a calculated move. He had faced this before, but never like this. They were pushing him, testing how far they could go. "I've already told you," Marcus said, his tone even. "I haven't broken any laws. You have no right to stop me." The taller officer took a step closer, his face just inches from Marcus's. "We'll see about that." Just then, Marcus's calm broke through the mounting tension. He pulled his wallet from his pocket, slowly enough to make the officers notice every movement. But it wasn't his ID he handed over. It was his Supreme Court badge. The taller officer blinked, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected reveal. The air between them seemed to freeze. For the first time since they had approached him, the officers paused, uncertainty clouding their judgment. You're a judge," the shorter officer's voice cracked, realizing the gravity of their mistake. Marcus stood still, his gaze unwavering. The silence was thick, oppressive, the weight of the badge hanging heavy in the air. The officers were frozen, unable to process what had just been revealed. Finally, the tall officer, still processing the shock, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir, we made a mistake," he stammered, his voice laced with uncertainty. His hand hovered near his radio, as if searching for any way to backpedal from what had just happened. "We're sorry, really. We didn't know—" Marcus cut him off, his voice cold and calm. "You didn't know? Now you do." He let that hang in the air, his eyes hardening with the weight of his next words. "See you in court." The officers exchanged a quick, uncomfortable glance, realizing the enormity of their blunder. They had no more excuses, no more options. What had started as a routine stop had turned into something they couldn't undo. The tall officer shifted uneasily, but there was no denying the truth. "We're truly sorry, sir. Please, let's just—" Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he turned, his movements deliberate as he walked toward his front door, the weight of their regret hanging in the air. The night that had started with suspicion and hostility now ended with an undeniable truth. Justice had been served, quietly, resolutely, and on his terms. The sterile atmosphere of the courtroom was a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the quiet suburban street that night. The two officers sat at the defendant's table, their uniforms replaced by plain suits, a visual reminder of the authority they no longer wielded. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs, reporters jotting notes, and spectators waiting for the inevitable reckoning. When Marcus Williams entered, the room fell silent. Dressed in his judicial robes, he carried an aura of calm power, his gaze steady as it swept over the room. He took his seat at the bench, his presence commanding respect, even from those who had once treated him with none. The officers avoided his gaze, their once confident demeanor replaced with visible unease. They had come to realize the gravity of their actions, not just as a professional embarrassment, but as a public lesson they could never escape. The prosecutor rose, detailing the events of that fateful evening. The unwarranted stop, the prejudiced assumptions, the abuse of authority. Every word landed heavily, the truth laid bare for all to see. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was calm but laced with a quiet intensity that demanded attention. "Officers," he began, his eyes fixed on them, "your actions that night were not just an error in judgment. They were a betrayal of the trust the public places in you, trust that should never be wielded as a weapon of prejudice." The taller officer, his face pale, stood hesitantly. "Your Honor, we made a terrible mistake. We know that now. We humbly apologize for our actions." Marcus let the silence stretch, the weight of their apology hanging in the air. Then he leaned forward slightly, his tone cutting through the room. "An apology is the first step, but it does not erase the harm done. Your actions that night could have escalated into something far worse. And for what? A baseless assumption? A prejudice you carried into your uniform?" The shorter officer shifted uncomfortably, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're ready to accept the consequences, sir." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "You'll do more than that. You'll undergo mandatory training, and this incident will remain on your records as a reminder of the weight of your badge and the responsibility it carries. Justice is not about punishment alone. It is about ensuring such actions are never repeated. The verdict was delivered, but the true impact was felt in the words Marcus spoke last. This courtroom is not just a place for justice. It is a mirror, reflecting who we are as a society. Let this be a reminder. Accountability is not optional, no matter your position. The officers nodded, their expressions somber. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the session. But the resonance of Marcus's words would echo far beyond those walls. This story isn't just about one man's courage. It's about a system that needs accountability and a society that must demand better. Moments like these force us to confront uncomfortable truths, but they also remind us that justice can prevail when we stand against prejudice. What do you think about this situation? Would you have handled things differently if you were in Marcus's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Your voice matters in sparking the conversations that drive real change. Together, we can shed light on the issues that need it most. Let's keep this dialogue alive.